humans are not physical things. We have chemicals, but somehow we transcend them. And the fascinating thing about how dopamine works is it's open to that transcendence as well. And there's, in a sense, two ways that we transcend ourselves. One is in the qualities we're seeking to live and embody. So we can increasingly embody spiritual realities.
Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of The Golden Hour, joined by Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, good to be back here with you.
Sharif, great to be back.
Yeah, Kevin, well, I thought we could dive in with an episode about dopamine, which seems to be a really important topic. Everyone's talking about it these days.
Everyone's talking about dopamine.
Yeah, and I think one situation where we hear about it especially is in the context of, well, obviously it's in the kind of self-help, self-improvement world, self-control. We hear about it in the context of social media, that, you know, when people are getting addicted to social media because every time they see a new post, every time they see a new picture, the social media websites have kind of apps have engineered everything to, you know, maximize these dopamine hits, and that's what gets people addicted. So I think people are interested in the topic, like how to regain control over their behaviors and attention.
It's a noble effort here to help people to have self-mastery. And people often do seem to blame their their indulgences on dopamine. And there is some truth to that. So I don't know. If someone were to ask me, is dopamine the most important chemical in the brain?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I would actually say that there are important chemicals in the brain. I'm not sure how important chemistry is. So,
Okay.
but there's interesting to see the the dynamics of the dopamine system, and to understand how that can make things easier or harder for people to be thriving and actually growing in self-mastery. So hopefully there's some knowledge of dopamine that is helpful so that people don't get discouraged prematurely and instead are able to be consistent and, in fact, take charge of their life again.
Mm-hmm. So is it helpful to then talk about kind of how, at a high level, maybe how this system is working? One thing I hear is that dopamine is less about pleasure and reward. Like, I think the way it sometimes is framed in popularly is that when you get a new social media post or when you get something pleasurable, you get a dopamine hit, and then you start craving dopamine hits because they feel good. But that's not exactly what's going on, is it?
It's a funny thing, isn't it, that, as I've heard you say, that all these books on dopamine, you know, the two best ones are probably The Molecule of More by Danny Lieberman, and then The Dopamine Nation by Anna Lemke. These aren't books for children to read because they're talking about a lot of different addictions people have. So these are books for adults, and, you know, particularly if you're interested in psychology. But the books are all saying over and over again, you know, that dopamine is not just the molecule of pleasure, but then everything they talk about is pleasure. So clearly, dopamine is, in fact, a huge part of what mediates our experience with something as pleasurable. So that when we experience intense pleasure, that is reinforcing to the dopamine circuits in a very profound way. What I found initially most interesting about dopamine is the idea of tolerance. So if a person is flooding their system with dopamine in any particular channel, let's say, and it could be purely behavioral or it could be substance mediated, their body responds to that kind of flooding by downregulating dopamine receptors. So now they have fewer receptors to respond to the flooding because the body's trying to get back to some kind of homeostatic balance. So there needs to be homeostasis. And if there's too much dopamine coming in a sense, causing it to be released, then your body responds by decreasing the number of receptors. What that means, though, is that it's going to take ever-increasing amounts of dopamine to get the same amount of pleasure from the thing. The other thing is that the dopamine you have available for ordinary life is then radically diminished. And the example I've always used is like if you're talking on the cell phone to someone and they're screaming at you, and then you turn your volume button way down. Well, then if you're trying to talk normally to them or another person afterwards, you wouldn't be able to hear anything. And that's what happens is you lose the dopamine tone of ordinary life. The ability to enjoy everyday pleasures, to be motivated for everyday tasks gets wiped out because of this phenomenon of the downregulating of dopamine receptors.
So that's what's called the dopamine baseline. Is that right?
So the dopamine baseline does change. Yep, and it gets lowered. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I found this very interesting. And in this opponent process model, with this paper by Richard Solomon, he talks about how after, it seems like a fairly ubiquitous phenomenon in neuroscience, that after one intense sensation, you experience the opposite to a greater or lesser degree. So after a period of intense pleasure, say, then you experience a kind of pain, and the pleasure, as you repeat this, the pleasure seems to go down and down, but the opponent process, the pain that's experienced after the pleasure is withdrawn, doesn't decrease over time. So you kind of get habituated to the one but not the other. And the subtitle of his paper is "Why Pleasure is Bad and Pain is Good," which is funny.
Exactly.
So it almost seems to suggest that because if you inflict some kind of pain on yourself, then the same thing happens, that pleasure is followed up with that. And then so if you continually inflict this kind of pain, which we'll get into how to moderate that, that the pain goes down and down, but the pleasure that's experienced afterwards stays the same. So something like he suggests, I think, cold water exposures, for example, which is very popular nowadays, or something like fasting, that the pain experienced from those gets less and less, but the pleasure stays the same. So what is that a better approach to actually maximizing pleasure in the long run?
Yeah. So I think that means is that if people are good at denying themselves regularly in different ways, as they will be more cheerful as a result. That's the opponent process. So if you push up too much on pleasure, you end up then having a persistent negative mood after. And that's been researched, and I think that's pretty well shown, that you're going to have this, you tend then to be just more irritable. So there's something about pleasure, especially intense pleasure, that can leave people then afterwards kind of down, and the cravings come back and they want it again. And then so they get into this, they talk about you can have abstinence agony, if you, and so, but there's these processes that people go through that suffer where they're craving the thing again. On the other hand, if people regularly embrace small and safe forms of pain that cause no harm to the body, and cold exposure is one, hot exposure like a sauna is another, fasting is one. All of those then actually lead people to having a persistent bounce in dopamine levels. And so their mood they end up feeling more energized, motivated, and positive in a more persistent way. So that also tells us then that what's interesting is like you can embrace then these, they're called hormetic stressors, but it's just something that hormesis is like a eustress for the system. To actually damage the body would cause distress to it. But to inflict these temporary things, that's eustress. It actually does lead to an increase in baseline dopamine that can be very enduring. So the more people build in these little practices, where they're embracing the discomfort, and some very small thing, just holding it present, it actually does lead to persistent good mood and cheerfulness afterwards. So the most cheerful people are those who can master these things most continually.
Right. So does it imply that I hope not, that you should never do anything pleasurable, like you should never have dessert or?
Yeah, not at all. So I think that dessert is going to be inherently rewarding. The way our bodies are built, sugar, chocolate, that kind of thing, for most people will be experienced as rewarding. And there is, like, sugar does cause a dopamine release, which is why
Hmm.
they hide sugar in so many foods, so that we do get this kind of dopamine release from eating it, and then we're incentivized by our reward system to want that food again. But I think that these things can be done in moderation. And so the
Hmm.
key is that you have, I think, a kind of mastery over what you say yes to and what you say no to. And you, I think, can live. It's like a kind of, there's an athleticism to this. Of never getting fixated on always no to this thing. Like never have
Yeah.
dessert ever, ever, ever. Or don't always feel like you are a slave to it and you always have to have it. But there is a
Yeah.
kind of fitness you have. And I actually think that that is the state that produces the highest baseline dopamine, therefore the highest general cheerfulness and good mood, is this kind of fitness that you can sometimes say yes and sometimes say no. You never
Hmm.
feel like you have to, but you always can savor it if you do. Because we know that savoring good things has its own effect on dopamine and raising baseline levels. So I think that the good that people have, the things they enjoy, they should savor them and be grateful for them. That is perfectly good mental health advice. But
Hmm.
also, they should not flee from discomfort as if discomfort is bad in itself. That would be very bad advice. Instead, they should learn how to, in a way appropriate and with common sense, embrace small forms of discomfort. They are good for them.
Now, I kind of cringe about asking this next question because it has a flavor that I really don't like. So one thing that's sometimes proposed when think about like eating dessert, say, is to have some kind of intermittent schedule for it so that your body never gets into this kind of routine to start expecting it. So if you have dessert every Friday night, your body, that's just a rhythm that your body or your dopamine system gets into. And then come Friday night, it's going to start expecting it. So one proposal, okay, have it Friday this week and then Tuesday next week, and or change the number of days in between. I mean, is something like that useful at all for people?
Oh, that's a interesting question. Because you could answer that just within the limited frame of dessert,
Hmm.
and maybe every, I don't know, it could be that I have no idea why honestly it would be bad to have dessert on a regular basis, like, at least once a week. So, I think that if people are struggling, with weight or eating disorders, that's just, maybe that's a different issue for them. They need to talk it out with the person they know. But in general, people would be okay with some of it.
Hmm.
Now, if it was causing problems in life and you felt like you were too attached to it, I could see why then sometimes go without it. You should be able to go without it for a day or two to do like, I mean, like a time or two, just to make sure that you're not internally too reliant on it.
Sure.
But it's probably not the main issue someone should focus on.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think sometimes with these dopamine discussions, I just feel like it's, in the end, nothing has more meaning because it has dopamine attached. And just mastering a dopamine system and its rewards and how it works and maximizing
Hmm.
that, to me, that doesn't seem like really high degree of human artfulness. The real human art is shaping our bonds and how we relate to others. That's where the real human shaping comes in and where all the higher ideals are lived. So if there are any ideals that would apply to intermittently withheld dessert, it's a pretty low level ideal.
Uh-huh. I think okay, that's a great segue because we've talked a lot about pleasure and dessert and so forth. So maybe let's raise the bar here. What one suggestion I've been very intrigued by, because the whole dopamine system seems so biological, is the or chemical or something, is that it can be affected and kind of trained on, maybe for lack of a better term, on higher things like ideals and bonds. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between dopamine in the sense of striving after an ideal, and can we shape this dopamine system to be working and helping to motivate us as we're striving for ideals,
Yeah.
not just striving to eat dessert more or
Yeah,
less.
exactly. I think that the in my sense, the way of some question or area of research becomes interesting is if it has what you can call a sapiential dimension, which is there anything about the study of this what field that can actually help people grow in wisdom? And what are the real wise lessons you can learn from understanding this science? That dopamine does have a number of these sapiential points that, like the one we were just discussing, it's not a low degree of wisdom to see that you are going to be more cheerful the more you're capable of saying no to things. That actually is pretty wise. Few people really master that. So if you can understand how dopamine works, and then that leads you to really master this, to embrace the little discomforts that come throughout the day, in a generous way, knowing that in fact they help you in the end, well, that's pretty wise. But this thing you're mentioning now is even wiser, and that's that we are not conditioned. I mean, you think like dopamine's a physical thing, it's a chemical, but humans are not physical things. We have chemicals, but somehow we transcend them. And the fascinating thing about how dopamine works is it's open to that transcendence as well. And there's, in a sense, two ways that we transcend ourselves. One is in the qualities we're seeking to live and embody. So we can increasingly embody spiritual realities, ideals. And you do come to actually embody ideals the more you grow in them. It's almost like you're physicalizing ideals through the effort and work you put into making them real in your life. So you actually become these ideals more and more and more. So dopamine is one of the things then that is involved in that whole system, because it's, as they constantly tell us, it's not just the molecule of pleasure, although it is that, but it also really is the molecule of progress, so that you get it as you're making progress. So if you're making progress towards an outcome, and that outcome is somehow important to you, maybe it's your business making a certain amount of money, then you get a bit of oomph to go for that. But the problem is that once you get it, you get some pleasure from it, for sure. And then it's quickly gone, and now how are you going to get dopamine back? Oh, I guess you have to set another outcome goal. Let's set it twice as much as before. And it's kind of this thing that you feel like you're just kind of chasing things that then become less and less meaningful. But that would be a misuse of this system. Really, you should be asking yourself, like, what can you deepen here? What can you grow in? If you are making progress in deepening how you live ideals, you actually get deeply motivated by that progress. So I think that every person has certain ideals that speak most loudly to them, that resonate with them the most. And I know that for me, being protective of people and being reliable are super important. And so I would hate for someone to feel like they relied on me and I would have let them down, or that I needed to protect them and I didn't. So as I anything that helps me to do that more and to be more reliable is really deeply motivating, and it resonates. So dopamine is certainly involved then in the motivating power of progress. The more you see you're making progress and the more motivated you get by that, the more surely dopamine is involved. So that's with ideals. And then bonds are the other way we transcend ourselves. And dopamine also gives us, as the bonds are deepening, is very sensitive to the quality of our bonds and seeing that these bonds are progressing. And as they get deeper and deeper, you get more and more dopamine as you improve them. And bonds are the setting for living ideals. So these things go together.
Well, Kevin, that's a very profound point to help people see the connection between this molecule dopamine and these deep concepts like ideals and bonds. And the last question I wanted to ask about, maybe is a slightly different topic, is about, it's one of Rashad's favorite topics related to dopamine, I know, and I don't know that much about it, but it's the reward prediction error. So I wonder if you could explain that for our listeners, and then how does that relate to dopamine and what we've been discussing so far?
Yeah, so reward prediction error is talking about when your reward system has predicted a certain level of reward from a given activity and it got surprised by a much bigger reward. It ended up being much more pleasurable than you thought it would be. So if you were going to Chipotle and you got their new burrito and you were expecting it to be so-so and it ended up being incredibly good, that
Hmm.
delta is the reward prediction error. And that has a huge impact then on how much dopamine you get in the moment, and then therefore how much motivated you are in the future to pursue that. The this What's interesting when you think about reward prediction error is it's basically how positive something ended up being when you weren't expecting it to be so positive, or even you were expecting it to be kind of painful and it ended up being good. So that means then that dopamine has another relationship to reframing. Okay, so not only is it involved in like when you can see how something is an opportunity to live an ideal, and then like, ooh, now I can make progress in my, in being more loving, being more kind, being more compassionate, and then you get kind of more motivated to engage the challenge. It's also that when you're dreading something that is coming up, or you're reluctant to do it, which means that you don't see much reward in it at all. Reframing can unlock the potential for an enormous reward prediction error. So that, yes, this meeting could have been awful if it had brought out the worst in you. But if this meeting, if you can find a way to see how it can bring out the best in you, and then you start bringing out the best in others, and then you have a great meeting together, now you get this huge dopamine surge.
Mm.
So, because you got the, and so when people learn how to practice reframing, they can generate reward prediction errors all over the place.
Hmm.
Everything that they thought could have been, terrible, they end up being able to draw goodness out of it. So, uh, it to quote the mystic again, John the Cross, but where you find no love, put in love, and you will draw out love. That's like the reward prediction error.
Hmm.
So, from 400 years ago, it's, but this is what reframing allows us to do. These situations that we would rather avoid end up becoming unsuspectedly good because they give us more meaningful progress in our ideals. They bring us closer to those that we love most, we want to serve the most, and then therefore we feel them as rewarding.
Awesome, Kevin. I think that's the perfect note for us to end on today.
Great, Sharif. Well, thanks for your questions.
Yeah, thanks so much. We'll be
So,
back next week.
until next time. Goodbye.